Wonderful stuff. Recording is in progress, hopefully, so it's probably also a cue for me to get on and move the meeting on a little bit faster. We have, and I'll introduce the speakers individually when I get to them, but we have Brian Leishman, MP. We have Anne Hallam from Brighton, Cuba Solidarity Campaign. Professor Radhika Desai will be joining us online. We have Andi Kocsondi, a Napo, Probation Officers Union activist, Georgina Andrews from Unison, and Rafael Rodríguez to my left, the First Secretary of the Cuban Embassy. With no more ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who's Brian Leishman, parliamentary. Oh, Jamshid, I beg your pardon. Just before our first speaker, I'm going to invite Jamshid up, who's going to say a few words to you about the late Maggie Bowden. Jamshid.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good evening, everybody. My name is Jamshid Ahmadi. I am on the Executive Committee of Liberation, the oldest human rights and voluntary sector organization campaigning in this country from 1954. Of course, Brian is going to tell you all about liberation and what liberation stands for, perhaps in his speech. But today, I just came from the funeral of our long-time General Secretary, Maggie Bowden, a very famous and dedicated leader of our movement, was the General Secretary for 30 years, from 1990s till beginning of 2020s. And so I thought that it is fitting to let you have a taste of what a personality we lost through the death of Maggie Bowden. Maggie died one day short of her 95th birthday early in September. And today in her funeral event, Jeremy Corbyn MP was one of the main speakers, in addition to a number of those very well-placed speakers who went through the life and the struggle of Maggie. So I thought that I just pick up some of what they said about Maggie to tell you how wonderful this person was. She was a working class lass from Wales, from a mining village. And at the age of 15, her journey into politics started. She eventually moved to London with her family in search of job. And in that stage, she became political. She joined the YCL and at the age of 15, and then went on to become a full-time campaigner for justice across the board. In the word of some of people who spoke about Maggie in the tributes, she was an inspiration. Maya, one of the persons that knew her, said she was the most hardworking, fierce, compassionate, and justice-oriented person she has ever known, Maya. And another colleague who worked with her said that she was a wonderful human being. She showed just how much one talented, dedicated, determined woman can achieve. Sue, another campaigner who worked with her, said that I learned from her all those years ago that it is possible to have a little child and work. Denise and Tess, two other lawyers who were working with Maggie, recalled her great humanity and achievement as a lawyer. They said she never gave up. She remained true to the struggle since she was just 15. She joined the YCL and then the Communist Party. She opposed the atomic bomb, joining CND and marching from Aldermaston to London, and against the war in Vietnam, as well as against apartheid in South Africa and Palestine, and for the freedom of political prisoners. Amongst her many, many commitments, she became the Communist Party's women's organizer in the 1980s. For 30 years, she was the Secretary of Liberation, heading our organization struggle for freedom, democracy across the world, working with Tony Benn, John McDonnell, John Bowden, her late husband, Stan Newens, MP, George Anthony, a great trade unionist, and Kelvin Harpin. Kelvin Harpin was the last chair after Jeremy Corbyn and before Brian took the reign earlier this year. Tom Sibley, one of the great trade unionists in the engineering union, told about her, in the face of many obstacles, it was her determination and political nous which kept liberation going as an efficient, effective, anti-imperialist and anti-racist body. We are all in debt to her for her outstanding contribution to building a better world. Jeremy Corbyn, who spoke today at her funeral, had a great admiration for her, for what she did, not only here in the movement, not only in the parliament, but also in United Nations. And she said she was my great friend. So we said farewell to Maggie, and the team that in Liberation has promised, has committed itself to continue that journey. And we are very glad that Brian Leishman, MP, has joined us, and we hope that with Brian's help, we will be able to continue this journey. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you so much, Jamshed, for that moving tribute to Maggie. With no further ado, I'll move on to our first speaker, Brian Leishman, Parliamentary Spokesman for Liberation, which was formerly called the Movement for Colonial Freedom. I first came across Liberation when Tony Gilbert and Kay Beecham were running it. Heroes from Kay Beecham, a founder of the Daily Worker, the forerunner of the Morning Star, and Tony Gilbert, of course, a hero and a fighter in Spain during the Civil War. Brian here, of course, is also a truly dedicated internationalist, and he's come all the way down from north of the border for this meeting here in Brighton. He was recently suspended from the PLP for opposing welfare cuts. And he has been a staunch opponent of militarism and a proponent of an independent, progressive foreign policy. Brian, over to you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Calvin. And I would just like to echo my comrade Jamshed's very, very timely and excellent contribution about the dearly departed Maggie. Thank you for that. Friends, comrades, today President Trump spoke at the United Nations for 56 minutes. He was only given a 15-minute slot. I am nowhere near as self-indulgent at that. I will keep to time, I promise, Chair. And what a pleasure it is to be here with you all this evening. And thank you to everyone involved for organising and putting this event on, for the invite and for the opportunity to listen to and speak with you tonight. To be in the company of speakers that have such a comprehensive knowledge of the unfair, unjust treatment Cuba has and continues to be the victim of is both enlightening and a privilege. So thank you. As a current MP and as Parliamentary Chair of Liberation, my main focus this evening will be on the current state of British foreign policy and the need for us to break free from being a subordinate to and an auxiliary of the United States. But before that, if I may touch lightly on Cuba. Comrades, we are aware that for over 6 decades now, Cuba has been the victim of economic and diplomatic warfare. From the sanctions designed to impoverish the Cuban people and cripple their domestic economy, a programme of almost relentless pressure being placed on the international community from the US to treat Cuba as a pariah state. The state-sponsored attempted coup that was the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, the missile crisis a year later in 1962 with the world at that time on the brink of nuclear war, to the 1980s with the designation of Cuba as a sponsor of terrorism by President Ronald Reagan, all at the same time the American president's own foreign policy pursued that of Cold War confrontation with his administration funding anti-communist forces in Afghanistan, Angola, and by covertly selling arms to Iran to then fund the Contras in Nicaragua. The American hypocrisy of labelling Cuba as sponsors of terrorism is both incredible and frankly laughable. And now, most recently, we have President Trump's memorandum that will impose even tighter, more draconian sanctions on Cuba. But why is Cuba so feared? Why is Cuba deemed worthy of the ignominy of being placed under stifling economic and diplomatic sanctions, standing accused of sponsoring terrorism? Cuba is feared because Marx's analysis of capitalism gets to the very heart of politics all over the world, the issue of class struggle and who actually holds power. Because over those 6 decades, Cuba has shown up the weakness and insecurity of capitalism, imperialism, and neo-colonialism. And for the UK, with our own imperial and colonial past that once covered a third of the globe, it may seem a peculiar claim for me to make, but Britain is now a victim of the same imperial force we used to wield. Because when it comes to our foreign policy, we are subservient to the United States. British foreign policy is not formed, shaped, or even robustly debated within the corridors of Whitehall. British foreign policy does not draw on the historic, morally just changes achieved through decades of decolonisation or the political gains achieved by working class people either at home or abroad, nor is it based on domestic or international struggles, campaigns or causes like the campaign for nuclear disarmament or the civil rights movement. Rather, both current British domestic and foreign policy can be summed up as being driven by a passion for militarism. At home, the government is embarking on a programme to make us a quote-unquote defence industrial powerhouse. Politicians are queuing up to extol the virtues of this increased military expenditure as a method of driving economic growth, of improving people's living standards. But the reality is that the UK economy continues to stall. Millions of Britons all over the country continue to become poorer. And what the government doesn't want politicians to do is to tell the truth that this increase in military spending comes at the expense of funding the vital social needs the UK has after a decade and a half of crippling austerity. Austerity that has exaggerated existing inequalities, created new ones, immiserated communities, and caused hundreds of excess deaths. Instead of building hospitals to save lives or schools to educate, upgrading infrastructure and investing in the public services to actually improve living conditions, the government has chosen to embark on a spending spree of tens of billions of pounds on military hardware with the expenditure inevitably flowing to private capital. As British military spending supports less than 1% of the UK workforce, it will be weapons manufacturers that benefit from the so-called defence dividend. Of course, this defence spending is inextricably linked to our foreign policy. With this drive to rearmament and defence spending, we see that arms manufacturers are being allowed an extraordinary influence in British policy making and decision taking. The highest and most powerful politicians in the land are painting a very bleak picture, trying to convince the public that being on a war footing is not only necessary domestically, but it will keep us safe internationally. The Chancellor warns that the world is changing. The Secretary of State for Defence warns that warfare is changing. The Prime Minister warns that Britain must become a battle-ready, ironclad nation. But this rhetoric is not designed at all to keep us safe. No, it is a tactic to exploit, a tactic to promote private capital and imperial interests. The Prime Minister even framed the decision to cut overseas development aid as necessary as it was a direct choice between security at home or helping some of the most impoverished people in the world, those living in the gravest of danger. Frankly, a foreign policy that abandons people is not one this country should ever adopt. Earlier this year, I was proud on International Women's Day that Liberation organised for 5 women to attend Parliament. Women from Gaza, Iraq, Iran, Western Sahara and Sudan detailed the persecution, the apartheid, the threat of sexual violence, the grinding penury and the ever-present threat of death they have to live with in their homeland. Our overseas development budget does so much to alleviate those frightening circumstances. And now, as the world is more unequal, more dangerous than it ever has been, British foreign policy is to copy that of the United States. President Trump has cut billions of dollars that was already approved by Congress from American international development, with the White House stating that the Trump administration will cut government spending that is woke, weaponized, and wasteful. There's $3 billion cut from US aid, $800 million from international peacekeeping operations, and more than $300 million to encourage democratic values and practices in other countries. And by mirroring this policy and cutting our own overseas development aid, the UK is contributing to that growing global danger faced by the most vulnerable people in the world. And we further compound this by continuing to sell arms to nation states that abuse human rights. This is the politics that divides people, that only sows discord and disharmony, that creates division and a world where the attitude, quite frankly, is to hell with your neighbour. Not only is this immoral brand of politics the antithesis of the socialist tradition of internationalism, it is a totally false economy. Because to choose rearmament over foreign aid so that corporations make obscene profits and shareholders get their dividends, it will not make the world a safer place. It will only serve to fuel poverty and further inequality. Comrades, Britain's passion for rearmament is inherently wrong and serves to deliver a doomed British foreign policy. In Europe, we know that the war in Ukraine has come at a cost of hundreds of thousands of lives, the displacement of millions, global economic turmoil, and a heightened chance of those nuclear weapons our government is committed to acquiring eventually being used. And it's not just in the UK that economic policies are being abandoned for military spending. Other European nations are also undertaking huge rearmament programmes. This grotesque military expenditure is a pan-European effort to curry favour with the United States. Western and Central Europe will be full of missiles and nuclear weapons while war rages on the east of this continent. With European nations preoccupied with this, as NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte said, it means the long-held US goal to pivot towards Asia can be realised. So, the foreign policy that our government is trying to convince the British public of, that we will achieve peace through rearmament, that we will achieve improved living standards through military expenditure, is completely Orwellian in nature. Where Britain is essentially Airstrip 1, an island that is no more than a strategically placed military base. Because when it comes to having American nuclear weapons on British soil and our wider foreign policy, the UK's servitude to the United States is symptomatic of imperialism and neocolonialism. That is the reality against the majority of the British public's wishes, because there is a growing opposition to both US nuclear weapons and military bases being here. These nuclear weapons in those bases do not strengthen our economy or our safety, and they most definitely do not strengthen our democracy, nor are they a deterrent. In fact, contrary to deterring, they only serve to increase nuclear proliferation. It's a nonsense for the government to suggest that American nuclear weapons, missiles, or arms are part of a domestic industrial strategy, or should be essential parts of what we pass off as our foreign policy. Because even if we discount the moral argument of these weapons, having these weapons here means our foreign policy most certainly is not independent. The UK could only use these weapons of death with the authorization of the President in the White House and his newly branded Department of War. So the colonisation of Britain's foreign policy has been a long-term project. But instead, the UK should adopt an independent, progressive foreign policy, one that abandons both austerity and militarism, and us being the junior partner to the United States. There's no doubt about it, our foreign policy should be one rooted in humanity. One that fellow Scot, the ex-Foreign Secretary Robin Cook, spoke of when he called for a truly ethical British foreign policy. He spoke of the need to make human rights a global reality, a commitment to prevent war, to stop arms sales to repressive regimes, to follow and critically uphold international law. And by pursuing that moral cause, Britain would benefit at home and abroad, as would the collective international community. And that is what many MPs in the House of Commons have always and will always campaigned for. So thank you for your time this evening, comrades. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brian, for that authoritative global overview of the threats and the opportunities facing the world. If people are able to stick around to the end of the meeting, then hopefully we'll have enough time for questions for the panel. I'm sure there'll be some interesting questions for Brian. Before I move on to our next speaker, I'd just like to thank the hosts of the meeting, the Sussex Readers Morning Star Readers and Supporters Group, Liberation, you've already heard about, and of course the Cuba Solidarity Campaign. I'd like to thank the following trade unions and trade union branches for their generous support for this meeting. Unison branches, University of Sussex branch and University of Brighton, and the Unite Brighton branch. At the end of the meeting, we'll be holding a collection, and the money will be split equally between the Morning Star Fighting Fund and the Cuba Vive Medical Appeal. So please don't try and escape without leaving at least something, if not your card details, before you go. So moving swiftly on to our next speaker, who'll be joining us online, Professor Radhika Desai, Professor in Political Studies at the University of Manitoba and visiting Professor in International Development at LSE. Radhika is a Marxist scholar of political economy. She has written several books and many articles in this field, and she'll be joining us via video link from Canada. Radhika has to leave at 8:15. So when it comes to questions, I'll be taking questions to Radhika first. If it appears there won't be, Radhika will get timed out for questions. I might fit some questions in for Radhika between other speakers. But the welcome, please, to Radhika Desai.
Okay, lovely to see you, Calvin, and thank you very much for that introduction. Let me just find my, here we go. Okay, so yes, and thanks also to all the organizers that Calvin just listed. And I just also wanted to say how much I agreed with so much of what Brian Leishman had to say just now. Working people have absolutely nothing to gain from an aggressive foreign policy, a militarist foreign policy. That miserliness at home goes with punitive foreign policies abroad, and all those things. They were really well taken. So let me give you a few things that I had prepared to say. So how are we to understand the United States proliferating use of sanctions in the 21st century, and of the SSOT designation, which is particularly pernicious variant of sanctions in that it cuts off access to indispensable international monetary and financial infrastructures, without which a state becomes a sort of international persona non grata in the world of commerce. Why were sanctions and the SSOT designation on Cuba both lifted under the Obama administration and diplomatic relations established? And while the Trump administration's reimposition of sanctions and the SSOT designation can be dismissed as part of the rogue president's trademark sadism, why did Biden not undo them until the very end of his term, when he knew that the returning Trump administration would only reimpose them? To answer these questions, we must place sanctions and economic warfare more generally, which are wrongly viewed as more humane than war, in the framework of the international relations of the age of capital. These international relations are centrally about imperialism. They are governed by the horizontal logic of inter-imperial relations of conflict as well as cooperation, and by the vertical logic of imperial subordination and resistance to that imperialism. The use of sanctions as a form of war since the early 20th century is implicitly or explicitly contrasted with the 100-year period between the Napoleonic Wars and the First World War, often called the 100 Years' Peace, when war appeared to be neatly separated from international economic relations. After the Congress of Vienna, Karl Polanyi argued in his Great Transformation that effective safeguards were erected for the continuance of peaceful business in wartime. The wars of the French Revolution furnish us with the last important examples of the confiscation of the private property of enemy subjects found in belligerent territory upon the outbreak of hostilities. In respect to the status of enemy aliens, the service of loans held by enemy citizens, enemy property, or the right of enemy merchantmen to leave port, the 19th century showed a decisive turn in favor of measures to safeguard the economic system in wartime. Only the 20th century reversed this trend. This was regarded as progress delivered by capitalism. Of course, we must underline that such respect for the sanctity of the private property and for capitalist commerce did not apply to the colonies even then. European countries considered one another members of a society of nations in a civil state which respected private property. Those outside this pale were to be shown no such curtsies, as we know from the history of colonialism. Colonial nations were to be forcefully opened up to European capitalist commerce, and the full range of means from war to deindustrialization to famine and starvation could be employed without any restrictions and were employed in the colonies. The 100 Years' Peace was preceded by a British blockade against Napoleon starting in 1806, to which the French emperor responded with the continental system. That 100 Years' peace then ended with the British blockade against Germany during the First World War. Both had demonstrated the superior power of the British Navy over Britain's foes. Though this success inspired the writing of multilateral sanctions into the League of Nations Charter, the record since has been mixed, to say the least. League sanctions, of course, failed dismally to stop the war. After the Second World War, the United Nations Charter reserved the use of sanctions to the multilateral body. Though this inclusion is premised on the false assumption that somehow sanctions are less lethal and so more humane, thanks to the inclusion of Russia and China among the permanent members of the Security Council with vetoes, multilateral sanctions were used sparingly as long as the Cold War lasted. However, even during the Cold War, the United States, with its historical propensity to use economic warfare, which goes back to the days of its gunboat diplomacy, was not able to resist the use of illegal unilateral sanctions when it applied them against countries affiliated to the Soviet Union, and that, of course, included Cuba. After the demise of the Soviet Union, the appearance of the United States' unipolarity allowed the US to orchestrate multilateral sanctions through the United Nations for a while, though these possibilities wore off as other countries, particularly Russia and China, wised up to US intentions. Thereafter, in the new century, the United States has resorted increasingly to illegal unilateral sanctions as part of its now unconstrained aggression worldwide. The overwhelming majority of sanctions today emanate from the United States, with the EU and European countries running a distant second. One US Treasury report registered a nearly tenfold increase in sanctions from 2000 to 2021, from 912 sanctions in 2000 to 9,421 in 2021. Those depriving Cuba of essential imports, including ventilators during COVID, are, of course, among these proliferating sanctions. How are we to understand this? The literature on sanctions is bifurcated into two distinct streams. The first stream documents the horrifying effects of sanctions on civilians, particularly when wielded against weaker states. In a rare consensus, scholars agree that sanctions impose intolerable and entirely illegitimate human costs. This literature has forced the United States and the West to impose so-called smart sanctions on individuals rather than entire nations, and to lock in humanitarian exceptions, though it is not clear that their effects are any less lethal. Sanctions continue to devastate societies, and Cuba, with its ever-deteriorating economy of an increasingly patchwork socialism, with no adequate replacement for the Soviet-supported ones enjoyed, is among the worst affected. The other stream of the literature on sanctions focuses on the efficacy of sanctions. It concludes in another scholarly consensus that they usually fail in deterring the target state from undertaking the actions that sanctions are aimed to prevent. If tiny Cuba still stands against more than 60 years of the most comprehensive US sanctions, and North Korea, Iran, and Venezuela remain unbowed, sanctions are hardly going to deter Russia or China. Yet they keep raining down from Washington, and to a lesser extent from Brussels, London, and other Western capitals. This apparent paradox can only be resolved if we appreciate, as I've argued in my various works on geopolitical economy, that the power of imperialism has been declining since 1914. Of course, not as fast as you and I would like, but definitely declining. That the US has had the misfortune of seeking to become the world's leading imperialist power on the model of the UK until 1914, just when the world had already become multipolar in the 19th century and communism emerged in the early 20th century. Indeed, the very developments that undermined UK dominance were destined to make US dominance impossible, no matter how zealously pursued. The result was that not only is the US not hegemonic today, notwithstanding the most zealous pursuit of this ambition, it was never hegemonic, judged by its own ambition, even though it diluted that ambition, wisely forsaking the acquisition of a territorial empire on the UK model, which would have been impossible in 20th century conditions, even if much blood and treasure were expended. And there is no evidence that the US was ever eager to expend much blood and treasure. So the US settled for making the dollar the world's money on the model of sterling. Given, however, that sterling was not a national but an imperial currency, and that the sterling system rested on Britain's imperial inability to suck surpluses out of its non-settler colonies and export them as capital to its settler colonies and to Europe, the dollar could not replace it. Forced to supply liquidity by running deficits, the US first bled gold, and then, after the dollar's gold convertibility had to be ended in 71, has had to rely on vast, volatile, and crisis-prone expansions of financial activity to maintain the dollar's world role. This is an expedient whose contradictions are now approaching breaking point, which is why you hear so much about de-dollarization. These financializations have, moreover, weakened the United States' own economy, and to the extent that the rest of the Western world has followed the US, also their economies. And alongside the rise of socialist China, and to a lesser extent the other BRICS, are accelerating the decline of imperialism, and as well as US power, and of course, advancing multipolarity. US militarism and economic aggression today are prompted by a desperate desire to undo this verdict of history. However, neither military nor economic aggression is particularly effective. Just as the US has had a rather sorry record of military efficacy, consider Korea, Vietnam, and then, after overrunning tiny Panama or Grenada, its inglorious string of 21st century wars, so today its sanctions are also ineffective, most spectacularly against Russia, but also against its lesser targets. They can't even manage regime change in tiny and vulnerable Cuba. So today, US sanctions are not any sort of kinder alternative to war, as the US's ability to undertake military effort diminishes with the loss of technological superiority in arms, lack of coherent strategic thinking, and the unpopularity of wars among US citizens. Sanctions have become a principal means of US war. The US continues imposing sanctions today chiefly from a certain kind of madness. Nikolai Petro points out in the case of sanctions against Russia that they can be sold as an alternative to a war-weary nation. Without any clear way of measuring success, they can always be portrayed as successes, providing an escape from the reality of failure. With the imposition of each bout of sanctions, Petro argues, Washington experiences a political high. And then, he says, eventually, this political high wears off. The nastiness of the world intrudes. Once politicians become desperate for another, and politicians once again become desperate for another fix. Friends try to warn Americans that Washington's increasingly erratic behavior is beginning to hurt them as well. But how can they understand the burdens that America must bear as leader of the free world, which is why they can ignore these friends' advice. Eventually, as Americans' view of the world shrinks to the Washington Beltway, nothing but their own media-driven reality matters. Sanctions now provide the only semblance of calm, the only relief that politicians can rely on, so resort to them becomes habitual. In a similar vein, there is no evidence the US has any coherent strategy for Cuba. The imposition of sanctions provides, at best, a verisimilitude of power and pacifies constituencies of Cuban exiles in Florida and New Jersey. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So thank you so much to Radhika for that in-depth analysis of Western sanctions as a means of warfare against the backdrop of the relative economic decline of the United States and the whole of the collective West. I'd like to welcome our next speaker, who is Andi Kocsondi, a member of Napo, the National Association of Probation Officers, also covers family court staff. She is chair of the union's Mercia branch and has been organising and representing members since 2021. And she's currently on the executive of the General Federation of Trade Unions, representing young workers, and is passionate about recruiting, educating and mentoring young activists. Andi has a particular interest in international solidarity work and has participated in delegations to Iraqi Kurdistan and Cuba through her work with the GFTU. Andi will be joining us online, and I'd like you to extend a big welcome to her. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm really glad to be here speaking to you today. Thank you for the invitation. I was asked to speak on behalf of the GFTU tonight because in April 2024, I was fortunate enough to be selected and take part in the Mayday Brigade UK delegation. We spent 2 weeks in Cuba, predominantly on a purpose-built camp near Havana, but we travelled around quite a bit as well, hearing about the impact of the US blockade firsthand from Cuban people themselves. I, like many of my fellow delegation members, were not overly familiar with the history of the blockade. Some of the people coming there, that was their first ever kind of trade union delegation, their first experience being part of a brigade. And some of us did not fully understand the extent of the blockade and how it harmed Cuba's economy, healthcare and educational system on a daily basis. So it was quite an eye-opening experience for all of us. Since we returned to the UK, many of us have raised awareness, supported and contributed to the aims of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, as well as raised vital funds for medical supplies and other essential goods. I think we would all agree, those of us who attended last year, that it was a life-changing experience which had absolutely lasting effects on our understanding, not just Cuba, but the world and the importance of international solidarity. I could probably spend hours talking about our time in Cuba, so it's really difficult to summarise it in only a few minutes, but I'm going to give it a try. There were over about 300 young members from 30 different countries in the delegation, so it was a big camp that we were staying on. We predominantly spent the first week doing agricultural work for local farmers. The illegal blockade, which has now been in place for over 6 decades, as others have pointed it out, threatens food security of the entire population. The blockade extremely limits the import of essential food items, impacting the availability of very basic products, everyday products, such as rice, beans, cooking oil, bread, meat, and many more. So locals told us in detail that they're unable to purchase important parts for their agricultural machineries due to the US coercing other countries to refuse to sell goods to them. They struggle to even purchase fertilizers and chemicals used in food production. So it's not just that they're unable to import products, but they're also extremely limited in what they're able to grow and produce in the country. Members of the delegation worked across different farms and fields in order to help plant, weed, harvest, which saved money for the locals so they can focus their very limited financial resources on purchasing other essential items needed and to pay for labour costs for workers. The food shortages were very clear for us to see because even though we had very generous and welcoming hosts during the trip, food was very limited on the camp. So our breakfast was often just a dry piece of bread and a cup of milk or coffee. Only a small amount of meat was available for dinners. So it was a real shock to some people who went in terms of what we were able to eat whilst we were there. And that wasn't just on camp, it was also in restaurants. So it was seen in the hospitality industry as well that they were very much limited. I think the impact of our voluntary work hopefully shows the importance of practical solidarity to the Cuban people. Farm owners were extremely grateful for the help they received, and I think we all found it really, really fulfilling to actually be doing something for the people. I'm not a big speaker myself. I like to actually do things. So this was a really good way of getting to know the local people and do rather than just speak, as we often do at conferences and our events. We then visited hospitals south of Havana and delivered medical supplies. For example, gloves, catheters, feminine hygiene products, over-the-counter medication, surgical masks, and so much more. We learned from doctors and nurses that the US blockade massively reduces Cuba's capacity to import medicines, medical equipment, and the latest technologies, some of which are absolutely essential for treating life-threatening diseases. Any medicine that's registered in the US is blocked from being imported. So, for example, during COVID, Cuban scientists had to create their own vaccine because they were not allowed to purchase any from other countries. In the hospital that we visited, I saw doctors perform surgery after washing and drying disposable gloves and aprons, reusing them over and over again because they don't know when the next supply is going to be available. It was sobering that things that we take for granted in Western Europe are so scarce in Cuba. However, we also learned that despite this, the Cuban socialist healthcare system is internationally recognized as one of the best in the world. It's innovative, people-oriented, community-centered, preventative. For example, we were told by a woman in the community that the general practitioners and family doctors put so much emphasis on preventative care that if somebody misses their appointment for a smear test, they will literally get a phone call or even a knock on their door from their GP reminding them to attend. I mean, imagine that. I've certainly never seen this kind of approach in Warwickshire, where I live. I was also really surprised to learn that Cuba regularly sends medical brigades to help other countries with disease outbreaks and natural disasters. We could clearly see that they give at least as much international solidarity as others as they receive. We then spoke to athletes who are banned by the US from competing in certain sporting events due to the blockade. However, even when they are allowed to compete, the money they win gets frozen by the US and they cannot access it to reinvest it into their sporting careers. Certain applications and technological devices considered standard in different sporting disciplines are lacking in Cuba due to the blockade. So athletes have a significant disadvantage competing internationally. Even simple things such as a mat for children learning gymnastics is a rarity. People working in the tourism industry spoke to us a lot about how the blockade has made it extremely difficult for them to run a business. The shortage of food that I mentioned before, shortage of fuel and other essentials have resulted in a significant decrease in tourists visiting the country. Not to mention that entry to the US is banned for years after visiting Cuba for a holiday, for example. I mean, I know many people personally who were put off by this and they decided against visiting Cuba. Sadly, this meant that many, many locals had no other choice but to shut their businesses, which was their only source of income. Now, I saw these struggles last year. That was months before Trump was re-elected. I cannot even imagine what effect the increasing sanctions are having on the people I met there. This is why international solidarity is more important than ever. Many of us who took part in the brigade, not just in the year that I went, but also previous years, the people that I met at different conferences and Cuba Solidarity events, we've moved motions in our own trade unions to support the work of Cuba Solidarity Campaign. Many of us have written letters to MPs, attended rallies and protests to increase the visibility of the campaign and increase the awareness in the general public of what Cuban people go through on a daily basis. This is absolutely crucial, especially considering that there is so much misinformation and lack of reporting on this issue in the media. Trade unions also provide education to workers, which is completely missing from the school curriculum. So in Napo and the GFTU, we run online and residential events to educate young trade unionists about politics, socialism, and international solidarity. Now, I think Cuba is an absolutely brilliant example of how a country built on strong socialist principles can put their people first rather than greed and profit. Since I returned, I speak to our young members about the incredible resistance the Cuban people have showed, their goal to prioritise free access to healthcare, education, and the basic needs as fundamental rights for their citizens. I believe that truly reflects Cuba's commitment to social justice and equality. The Cuban people clearly still have a lot of fight in them, so we need to make sure we stand firmly with them in their fight for freedom and self-determination. And young trade unionists play an absolutely crucial part in the solidarity movement. So I hope that we can keep educating and inspiring young people about Cuba and what it truly represents. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. For someone who dropped in there that they're not a big speaker, I must say that was one of the most comprehensive and inspiring reports of any trip to Cuba that I've ever heard. So thank you so much for joining us, Andi. Before we move on to our next in-person speaker, Professor Radhika Desai does have to leave at 8:15. So I'm going to take 2 questions, if we have them, for Radhika, which she'll be able to address before she leaves. Does anyone have a question or a comment they'd like to make about Radhika's contribution? Well, in which we have one. Great, thank you. If you could introduce yourself as well, please.
My name is Asha. Sorry, bad introductions. I was going to say regarding Professor's very comprehensive overview on the rise of America after, especially the Olympics, which is not something I expect to hear about today as a history student. I was curious what she thought could be the trajectory of international politics, and especially the role of China in a multipolar world, because there is some hope among a lot of people that as China gains a bit more of a prominent stand in the global stage, it could begin providing relief to countries like Cuba when it as well is less under threat of American economic warfare.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. So Radhika, I don't know if you heard all of that, but to summarize it, the question was about the trajectory of international politics and the role of China in a multipolar world. So if we could restrict your response to, let's say, 3 minutes maximum, that would be really helpful, Radhika. Thank you.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, obviously, that's one of the most important questions that we are all wondering about today. And it seems to me that going forward, I mean, basically, I regard China and the fact that, you know, I mean, in a certain sense, I regard it as very significant that a decade or two after the end of the Soviet Union, we are once again at the threshold of a sort of capitalism-communism confrontation. And to some extent, I don't find that surprising, because in my analysis, what I found is that some form of socialism or communism is in fact the most effective way. I mean, barring the development of countries like South Korea and Taiwan, communism/socialism has been the only way in which countries have been able to develop effectively, to be able to provide their citizens with something resembling Western standards of living, not the same exactly, but still, you know, something was certainly much better than most of the countries that are trying capitalism. So I just want to say that. Number two, as far as China's role is concerned, I would think of it in terms of at least 2 or 3 different things. Number one, I think by continuing its development, including its technological development, I think it will be instrumental in demonstrating the superiority of socialist ways, particularly at a time when the financialized productively weakened capitalisms of the Western world, especially the United States, do not provide a very attractive model. Secondly, I think it is building more and more relationships of both exchange and solidarity with more and more countries in the world. So within a group of socialist countries, China has extended relations of solidarity to other countries. At the same time, I would say that it is now becoming the most important trading partner of the overwhelming majority of countries in the world. Whereas once upon a time it was the United States, it is now China. Whereas the United States is the most important trading partner of only a handful of countries, with, of course, Mexico and Canada are foremost among them. Thirdly, I think that China is going to play a very important role in reforming the institutions of international governance, or rather preserving the anti-imperialist content of the institutions of international governance that we have inherited, the so-called Bretton Woods institutions, and over time also purging it of the pro-Western, pro-corporate agenda that have been kind of smuggled into them over the post-Cold War decades in particular. So what China wishes to create is a form of international governance which is closer to the principles of the UN Charter, which are based on equal sovereignty, particularly the assertion of economic sovereignty, and of course, mutual respect, non-aggression, cooperation for mutual benefit, etc., etc. So I think these are the things we can expect China to do in the coming years and decades.
Great, thank you so much, Radhika. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and really appreciate you making time to come and address us and answer questions today. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd now like to move on to our next in-person speaker, who is, let me just check my notes, Hallam of Brighton CSC. Perhaps if I move along, perhaps we can bring another...
Yeah, I don't want to be rude and stand in front of you.
So you can bring another chair up. We can all fit along. Great. So thank you very much, Anne. You're chair of Brighton CSC, Cuba Solidarity Campaign, a stalwart international campaigner, and you recently visited Cuba's Matanzas province, which I believe is famous for its historically for its sugar production, oil production, and pharmaceutical industries. And of course, it suffered a devastating hurricane last year. So in no more ado, over to you, Anne. Thank you very much.
Do you want me to stand up so I can
That would be good, yeah.
further? Okay, sorry, I'm going to do that. Well, welcome to everybody. Brighton Cuba Solidarity Campaign is one of 25 local organisations, and I think it illustrates, the depth and reach of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, which is very much built on, participation of grassroots. And I count myself as one of those in this illustrious company of politicians and academics. Basically, our campaign in Brighton was founded over 60 years ago. Is that right, Tony?
Something like that.
Yeah, and there are still some of those founder members with us. And I think in terms of the reach that we have, I think we provide a really good service to the Cuban people, because our priority is actually, first of all, to provide solidarity by going to Cuba, finding out things, coming back and telling people about what it's like there. Because in the mainstream media, you're just not going to get that. And so we're very indebted to the Morning Star, which is a shining light in terms of alternative journalism. And, it's very supportive, and we thank you very much, particularly for the ability to come to this meeting and speak to an audience like yourselves, which is lovely to see so many people here. So basically, I'd like to first of all just tell you what we've been doing. What we do is we have regular monthly meetings, and what we decided was that you cannot isolate Cuba from the rest of Latin America. So because of this branding of Cuba on the list of terrorists with Venezuela and Nicaragua, for God's sake, we are part of the troika of terrorism. And that is something that has affected our work to a point that, for example, we've been collecting money for the medical appeal for Cuba. And in addition to that, we have our own project in Matanzas, where we visited recently. And one of the things that we found there was that there's a huge problem with hard currency, so that people cannot get the building materials and money to pay labourers. The hospital that we visited was actually a residential centre for adults with learning difficulties, and they had awful trouble because the roof was falling in. And so what we did was we've raised about £600 that we're going to go over next March or April to give them, which is a mammoth task in itself, because we feel that their commitment, the shining commitment they have to fulfilling their obligation to the less fortunate members of society who have been so badly affected by the blockade, is unbelievable. We were very humbled, because I can see what happens to people in this country. You know, old people with COVID shunted out into care homes, infecting people and dying, and, you know, the general lack of care, which is so different from what Cubans are achieving in spite of all the difficulties, and the sheer emotional commitment. You know, it's a very sort of loving society. In all of the schools that we've visited, all the care homes, the old people's homes, maternity homes, all of those show an incredible love and care for the people that they're charged with looking after. And it was very humbling, because they're so adamant they would do their best with such small amounts of money available and resources. And it made me feel quite inadequate, really, because I know I would have probably buckled under the pressure, and they hadn't. And that's, I think, something that informs our desire to help them and to overcome this blockade, which I find makes me so angry. And the fact that Cuba is on the list of terrorist organisations. I have here 6 pages, which were prepared by Dr. Steve Wilkinson. And this is 6 pages of examples of the United States-based terrorism against Cuba from 1959 up to 2001. And it goes from the bombing of an aircraft where 73 Cubans were killed, to spreading disease amongst the sugarcane plantations in order to infect sugarcane workers, and the arrest of the Miami Five, who were trying to put a lid on the festering cesspit of Miami, which was actually involved in all the disinformation that they could muster against Cuba and spying on Cuba too. So instead of applauding that, Miami actually arrested the Cubans that were trying to stop it. And we had a huge campaign to free them from prison in the United States. And the other thing that I found, oh, 1 minute, oh my God, okay. Apart from the chemical and biological warfare, I've just got this as well. And it's, you certainly recognise Henry Kissinger on this. And he was instrumental in drawing up plans to smash Cuba. And he was very, very exercised by the fact that the United States might lose its position in South Africa because Cuba actually sent, as you know, sent troops to Namibia to fight apartheid South Africa. And bad luck to Henry Kissinger, they succeeded. And Nelson Mandela was instrumental in thanking Cuba for this. First thing that he did when he was released. So what we do is we do practical work and we do plenty of meetings to spread the word. And in the future, what we want to do is strengthen our links with local organisations. And we are supported by local unions. If you get a chance, go and look at our store down there. And there are lots of fact sheets available from the Cuba Solidarity Campaign if you want to know more about any aspect of Cuba, and they're excellent. Just go on their website. I'll let you know what we're doing. In October, we've got a Zoom meeting with Francisco Dominguez, who is the Secretary of the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign, who will bring us all up to date on the atrocities that the United States is committing against Venezuela. And in November, we've got a fundraiser, and it's going to be for medical aid and also for our Matanzas project. I think if you get a chance, do try and you haven't been to Cuba, do try and go on one of the Cuba organised tours, which you will see there's a copy of Cuba Sea down there, and also it's advertised on Cuba website, and it gives an unparalleled understanding, and you meet all kinds of really fascinating people, as was mentioned before. So I'll stop there because I've been told I had a minute. Have I gone over?
Just a little, but that's fine. It was
sorry.
Thank you, Anne. It was definitely worth listening to the few seconds you went over. So thank you very much. For those who live in Brighton or nearby, please do get involved in the Cuba Solidarity campaign, both by joining and by getting involved in the grassroots work that these local groups do. So please do talk to Anne after the meeting. And we have signed.
Fundraising evening is going to be Saturday, the 16th of November at Worthing Labour Club. Great, fantastic. Saturday, brilliant. Saturday, 16th of November, date for your diary. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for that. Our next speaker will be joining us online. Georgina Andrews, who is the Unison rep at Halton Borough Council, where she works in children's services. She visited Cuba with the Young Trade Unionist Mayday Brigade earlier this year and is a very active campaigner in international solidarity. As a student at the University of Liverpool, she led the campaign to ban Bacardi from the student union bars. There's leaflets about the Bacardi campaign at the back of the room and further details on the Cuba Solidarity website. So a big welcome, please, for Georgina Andrews.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to speak. So yeah, like Hallam said, I'm Georgina. I'm a rep in Unison up in the Northwest. And in April this year, yeah, I got to go on the Young Trade Unionist May Day Brigade. And so I might be talking about similar things to Andi, but the difference between last year and this year is quite stark due to Trump's economic warfare, the intensification of that, and just the 6 decades of blockade and how that actually looks in Cuba this year. So we stayed at the same camp in the Artemisa province. So it's a rural province near Havana, and here we experienced the harsh realities that the Cuban people face, particularly in rural areas. It is different to Havana. So on the camp, we experienced multiple electricity blackouts a day. So on previous years, it was a lot more severe than it had been previously. This is due to Trump's tightening of the economic warfare. And also there were water cuts that happened most nights. So in the rural areas, these happen whenever they run out of electricity, and the water tends to be cut off at night to save that. In Havana, it's a different picture. So there's still blackouts, but they're planned. People are aware of them in advance because of the tourism. Some places have generators. So the divide between rural areas and cities is quite stark. And this is a direct consequence of the blockade, which is designed to wage economic warfare on the Cuban revolution. It's designed to make the Cuban people so miserable that they blame their government. But despite this, there wasn't misery in the air whenever there were blackouts or water cuts. We obviously cheered when it came back on, which was quite wonderful. You could hear hundreds of people across the camp and all the locals cheering. Just shows the resilience that people have, also the innovation to get over the shortages. Life goes on. People still live happy, joyous lives that are fulfilling. And the Cuban people are still committed to defending the Cuban Revolution. I never had a doubt about that. So we visited a polyclinic in Artemisa province. And similar to what Andi was saying, they're unable to import vital medical equipment due to the blockade. But despite this, the clinic was nearly empty. There was hardly anyone there apart from the nurses and the doctors. Because of the Cuban healthcare system, it's focused on prevention and also rehabilitation in the community. So here, Unison members from the Northwest. So before we went out to Cuba, we planned a international solidarity fundraiser. We booked a pub in Liverpool, invited friends and family. We raised nearly £1,500, and with that money, we bought medical aid to take on the brigade. And our brigade this year, apparently, it's the most aid any brigade's ever brought, which was really wonderful to see. But this material aid, it's necessary because of US imperialism and its impact, the sanctions, its impact on Cuba. We shouldn't have to be doing this, but we do. And the doctors and nurses are really grateful, for the solidarity and, the work that we're going to continue doing back in Britain that we're continuing to do. So we also went to a train maintenance depot in Havana. So here they have trains bought from Canada, China. These, trains, they're modern. They can go up to 170 kilometers per hour. But due to the blockade, companies and the government can't invest in the infrastructure. So, a lot of the railways are really old. But I come back to that point about innovation. And it's how they reuse the trains. If a train breaks down, they fix it rather than replace it. They do have to run it slower. They have to run slower than they can, so they run at 70 kilometers per hour. But the railway service, much better than ours. They are well staffed as well. They have to have security guards on trains due to threat of terrorist attacks from the US. But it's a service, it runs a lot better than our model, despite the lack of resources and the lack of investment. So we met with representatives from transport unions, And, they really reiterated that, trade unions are there to resolve workplace issues. It's not the only role of trade unions in Cuba. Defending the revolution is too, from the US's constant economic warfare. And that was, a theme throughout the trip, that everyone was defending the revolution in every aspect of life, because it impacts every aspect of life. So on May Day, over 600,000 people paraded through Revolution Square. This was led by healthcare workers. And it was the first time they were in Revolution Square since COVID. And they marched with immense pride. Many held placards denouncing the US blockade. And the parade was ended with the Cuban youth holding a banner stating "Long live Palestine." And we also met with some Palestinian medical students while we were in Havana, who were on free scholarships. Because the struggle against imperialism, many Cubans, the majority of Cubans, notice a connection that the US imperialism and its grips on the world and how it, impacts the working classes across the world. So that fight against imperialism is interconnected, and we should all be working together. So at the International Solidarity Conference, the Deputy Foreign Minister informed us that the state-sponsored terrorism designation is totally arbitrary and a weapon against Cuba. This is a designation from the US, who continues to fund and arm the genocide in Gaza. But, that's US's internationalism. Compare this with Cuba, where, for example, they ran a hospital for over 20 years, where they treated 25,000 Ukrainian children affected by Chernobyl, completely free of charge. So we got to visit this site. It used to be a luxury hotel complex for rich Americans to holiday in. And then after the revolution, it became a hospital for these children. So the state-sponsored terrorism label is not based on any evidence. It is a tool to strangle Cuba further, and it is the Cuban people who suffer. The US threatens international banks and investors with massive fines, cutting Cuba off from global trade. And it's a deliberate and cruel intensification of the blockade that is having real effect in Cuba. And that, some people in our brigade attended last year, and they said even in just that year, the changes were massive. So it's important that trade unions continue to support Cuba Solidarity Campaign and delegations such as the Young Trade Unionist May Day Brigade, because it grows solidarity with Cuba against US imperialism, and it exposes the hypocrisy of the state sponsors of the terrorism list. Fernando Gonzalez, one of the Cuban Five and president of ECAP, the Cuban Institute for Friendship, ended the delegation by telling us that solidarity is the antidote to the barbarism of capitalism. The brigade's final message pledged to fight until Cuba, Palestine, and all workers of the world are free. And that is something that we should do in every bit of activism in support of Cuba and against US imperialism here in Britain. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that report, Georgina. And especially thanks for your practical acts of solidarity on the Bacardi ban. If these big companies and the US government wish to blockade Cuba, well, let's turn the tables on them and block their companies, their products, and every other part of their businesses. So thank you very much. And finally, that's I'll take that as a drum roll for our last speaker. I'm delighted to welcome Rafael Rodríguez, First Secretary of the Embassy of the Republic of Cuba. He's here speaking to us on behalf of the Cuban ambassador, Her Excellency Ismara Vargas Walter. So Rafael, thank you so much for coming to speak to us today.
Well, my first word would be to say thank you for all the speakers for your invited to us to this beautiful evening and for this beautiful city, and for your time, for take part of your life to support to the Cuban people. Dear friends, the solidarity that friends like you have shown towards Cuba deeply appreciated. In face of measures that are devastating our economy and have affected the life of Cubans. The blockade is not a simple embargo, but a legal, regulatory, and political framework designed to obstruct all essential imports, foreign investment, access to international financial service, and cooperation. It is a comprehensive and extraterritorial policy that persecutes Cuba and those who dare to maintain trade or collaborate relations with us. An aggraving element in this arbitrary inclusion is the arbitrary inclusion of Cuba on the list of states of sponsors of terrorism. This designation, lacking an verifiable basis, imposes additional sanctions. It is an act of unilateral coercion incompatible with international law. This is injustifiable designation of Cuba on arbitrary and unilateral list of countries allegedly supporting terrorism is dishonest and responds to political motivations. It represents one of the measures with the greatest impact against our country, as it reinforces dissuasive and intimidate effects on third parties, has raised country risk, caused serious difficulties for our operations in the banking and financial sector, international trade, access to financing, to purchase of fuel, and acquisition of supplies of goods and inputs essential for economic development and discourage foreign investments. Dozens of banks suspend their operation with Cuba, including transfer for purchased foods, medicine, fuels, materials, spare parts, and other essential goods. The Cuban economy lost traditional suppliers due to country risk and the impossibility of accessing faster and more expeditious logical routes. Additional costs had to be incurred to acquire the inputs, which also resulted in delays in supplies of raw materials and serious damage to the production. The human cost of these policies is incalculable, but economic figures illustrate their severity. In the period of March 2024 to February 2025 alone, the blockade has caused estimated material damage and losses of $7,500 million. This damage affects all sectors of national life. To gauge its daily impact, let us consider the concrete example. 16 days of blockade equate to funding required to cover the country's basic list of medicines, 339 million. 16 days of blockade. These are not just abstract figures. They translate in shortage of medicines, blackouts, difficulties in transport, and serious limitation in access to food and essential goods for all the people. The public health sector is one of the hardest hit. Financial persecution and prohibition to accessing the use market hinder the acquisition of technologies, medicines, and medical devices, deteriorating the quality of service and various health indicators. The blockade is an international through legislation such as the Helms-Burton Act, which allows lawsuits in U.S. courts against companies from third countries that do business with Cuba. This directly attacks vital areas such as tourism, mining, and aviation, and fuel supplies. Against this offensive, international solidarity has been fundamental. Governments, social organizations, and human rights movements in Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and across all the world have raised their voices. Recently, several independent United Nations experts have urged the US government to lift the blockade and remove Cuba from the list of states sponsors of terrorism, qualifying these measures as acts of unilateral coercion that violate international laws and the human rights of the Cuban people. Friends, The Cuban people have demonstrated extraordinary resilience. Our struggle is not only to alleviate our suffering, but to defend universal principles, sovereignty, self-determination, and the right to live in peace and develop freely. International solidarity has been and continues to be an indispensable bastion on his path. We recognize and appreciate the continued support of international solidarity for Cuban efforts to end the blockade. In the current context of particular complexity, we reiterate our gratitude for your valuable support. Thank you very much to the Cuban Solidarity Campaign, in particular this branch.
Thank you. I'm only interrupting the applause because we're slightly short on time. Otherwise, I'm sure it would have continued. Thank you so much for that. A representative from an island that has done so much for people, not just in the Caribbean and in Latin America, but right across the world with their medical brigades, their other acts of solidarity, and in previous decades, military solidarity, including the defeat of the South African army in Angola. So it's an absolute pleasure to be able as a solidarity movement and on behalf of the Morning Star to be able to express our solidarity for Cuba, and that's for today, tomorrow, and always. So thank you very much, Rafael. Now, thank you. We have to finish at 10 to 9. Unfortunately, the room has to close and be cleared. So we have just 12 minutes for questions and speakers to answer. So I'm going to take 5 questions, and there'll be questions only. Please be brief and say which speaker you're addressing them to. We're going to start over there, the lady in the middle there. Thank you.
Visited Cuba. I visited Cuba on a different time. I've been visiting Cuba for I'm sorry that I do want to say this, so please forgive me. I've been visiting Cuba for the past 13 years. Every year I go for about 4 months. And for those 4 months, I travel length and breadth of the country, working in the universities. It's entirely funded by myself. And I've met a lot of people. I know just about the whole of Cuba. I know Cuba better than many Cubans. And I've worked with many universities. I've been to every province and worked in universities in every province. And 2 things that I think people didn't mention that are quite desperate. The first thing is transport is ridiculous. For students to get to their courses in universities, for teachers to get to the universities in order to, especially in Havana, in order to actually teach the students, and the second thing is, there is, what do you call it, people are escaping Cuba. The young people and the people who have been educated and working in Cuba, they see their only means of surviving. And this is the end result of the blockade. They see their only means as actually leaving. And they will go to any country.
We'll finish up because we've literally got 9 minutes. Thank you so much. Gentleman there, please.
Yeah, okay. With the extent to which China has grown now economically, to the point that it's a rival, a challenge to the American economy, I just cannot understand why China leaves Cuba in this position. I would have thought now, the amount of manufacturing that's gone to China would be well in a position to lift Cuba up in the same way that it's lifted so many of its own population out of poverty, largely as a result, I suppose, of its compromise with world capitalism. But why cannot it be doing more, with that size of economy now, to bring Cuba up
Great, thank you. Two great contributions. Could we have a third contribution? In the corner there, thank you.
Hi, I was just saying, recently in the UK, we've seen a massive increase in support for a broad anti-imperialist movement, the pro-Palestine, anti-New Cold War, pro-Congo and pro-Cuba movements. How would anyone from the speakers, how would we view the relation between these different struggles? How are they related? How can we collaborate between the different people?
Great, thank you. Any other contributions? Great. Well, we'll leave it at that. So we've got three contributions. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go online first to oh, they've all left online, right? I can't actually see the computer that way, although I'm chairing. I'm slightly behind the curve here. Thank you. Well, that makes it a little.
No, it's just gone weird pixelated rainbow picture thing.
Right, okay.
I tried to direct you towards it.
Great. Well, what we'll do, we have three questions. So I'm going to start with Anne. If we get anybody back online, I don't know if we will, then they can chip in very briefly. We had three questions or contributions. One about some of the problems in Cuba, transport, young people leaving the country for better opportunities, etc. A second question, in summary, why can't China do more to help Cuba? And a third question about how the panelists view the relationship between different campaigns and social movements taking place. So, Anne, I don't know if you'd like to go first, but please, can we have about 1 minute for each contributor? Thank you.
Well, basically, in reply to the lady here who's been to universities across Cuba, we went to Havana University and did some English teaching with the students there who are going to be teachers, who have many more degrees than I would ever think of getting. And it was really sad because a couple of months ago, I got an email from one of the lecturers there who said that he'd been forced to leave and get a teaching job in Mexico because of the lack of opportunities. And a lot of the students there said they were going to leave and just find some employment when they could get some decent hard currency somewhere else. And I think really to answer the last question, I don't know enough about China. Basically, I think that all of these movements, as we've seen in Brighton, are very close together, very close indeed. As I look round, I think I can see half the people here are in Palestine Solidarity and Cuba Solidarity. And I think it is a very solid anti-imperialist urge that is growing, thank goodness. And much fueled by absolute anger at Trump's complete stupidity and pettiness and brutality. But all of it, really, we can see it in historical concept. And you only need to know a little bit about it, as I do, to really feel that there might be light around the corner, possibly.
Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you.
On this lady's points that she made about the students having difficulty travelling to university, I mean, that was very much our experience when we went there last year. The transport is a huge problem, a lot to do with the price of oil and other issues. And one of the things that we did when we went to the University of Havana was to take things like memory sticks, so that they could continue the distance and expand the distance learning that had started during COVID. And that was a very simple, small thing that we could take, but it was very much appreciated. Now, again, they're finding ways around it, but certainly distance learning. I mean, they said that students used to come into university 5 days a week, and they can now come perhaps 2. So therefore, things like memory sticks, I think, the distance learning will at least a partial solution.
Thank you. Great ideas for practical solutions to pressing problems in Cuba. Thank you. Brian, would you like to?
Yes, no, thank you. And thank you for all the questions. The one I'll probably focus on is, in my experience as a new parliamentarian, is yourself. So the last question from the gentleman there. Certainly what I found as a new MP, I was elected for the first time July last year, and I'm not from a kind of, I would say, inverted comma, a typical MP background, in that I didn't work for an MP or an MSP or a think tank or an NGO. Basically, I was a golf professional for 23 years who has ended up becoming a member of parliament. But I would say that that's actually quite a beneficial thing. But one of the things that I've felt overwhelmingly in my first 15 months or so is a frustration at the lack of politicians that actually want to talk about capitalism's effects, its negative effects on society at home and abroad, and fundamentally about the issue of class. There's very, very few parliamentarians that actually want to address that in Parliament, and I find that immensely frustrating. But to go then back to your point there about the kind of coordination of campaigns, the coordination and the collaboration between different organisations and different causes, I think, is of paramount importance. And something that I would definitely say to you all is MPs, generally speaking, a lot of MPs do not like having to represent you and the causes and the campaigns that mean the world to you. So what I would say to you is bombard your MP. Now that means by emails, by telephone calls, by requesting constituent surgery appointments, because MPs will find it harder to say no to you across a table in a community hall and somewhere like this when you're actually making demands of them. Because I would relate it to this. I have had 74 emails from constituents to talk about the impacts of greyhound racing. Now, no one thought we were going to talk about that this evening. But if I've had 74 constituents write to me about this, it's something I'm going to raise on the floor in the House of Commons, because I'm there to represent their needs. Now, I might not always agree with you politically, but I'm there to represent you. I'm a public representative. So I would say exert as much influence and as much pressure on your Member of Parliament as you possibly can. That's what they're there for.
Right, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Brian. And I know it's a little bit far away from you, but if you get a chance to reopen Walthamstow Dog Track, that would be greatly appreciated.
The 72 emails were against.
Oh, they were against. See what a controversial business this is when you get into Parliament, you know.
Make a quick correction. Sorry about the date of that. It's my mistake.
Can we do that?
I can come to the stall afterwards. That'd be easier.
Definitely the 22nd of November, not 16th.
Okay, 22nd of November, and the details are on the stall. Thank you. Lovely. Thank you for that. And finally, final right to reply. Rafael Rodríguez, the floor is yours.
Yes. Well, regarding the question of the lady, I meet you. I give you some visas to go to Cuba. Yes, she's a teacher in Cuba for many times. She support Cuba for many times. This is a big challenge to our government. The migration is a big challenge to the Cuban people. It's an older population in Cuba, and the young people is looking for new opportunities. The blockade is an integral policy that is designed to create this stress in the population, in the young population. The blockade conform inside this policy a way to provide to the people, to the young people, this stress. The young population feel that they do not have opportunities, but I think that they have the big opportunity being in Cuba, because the studies are free from the childhood to the university. They don't need to pay anything to the government for the studies, and they need to believe that it's possible to make another country. Who can make the new country? The old people? They can't. Must be the new, must be the youngers. But more than the blockade, the propaganda against the people, against the young people over the media is very, very, very hard. The United States creates the laws there who provide the straight way to the Cuban people to arrive the United States for any ways. With the Donald Trump government, this government, the measures against the migration are very strong. The migration from Cuba to the United States was stopped because they are deporting from United States all migrating, all greatest, yeah. Sorry for my English, please. And is to our government, we need to create new opportunities. We need to educate the young population. I was talking with friends here in Brighton in the afternoon. They are young people, and they think about these matters on this way. I haven't opportunities in Cuba. Why? Because I don't income a lot to be a great life as I like to have, but they don't know what does the revolution was in the 18th, in the last century, when we have another economic situation. Presently, around the 2017, 18, with the Obama government, we see other economic situation. We see a new way to have a relationships with United States government. We increase the tourism, we increase the economy. The people fear another wave on the streets, and the migration was around zero because the young people see opportunities. With the bad economies, we can understand that the young people need to see other ways. But yes, we understand this problem, and our government is working very, very hard in education and in create new opportunities for works, for the families, for deliver new opportunities for have the people, young people have a life. In Cuba, I have a reflection about one thing that is very important for us. We have many people, many families living in one house, many generations of families. But in Cuba, the 90% of the houses are private properties. See, I mean, the people have the property of his houses. The people do not pay and landlords something. And this is one view, another view of this problem. When you go young for one people to work, to migrate to these people, it's very difficult to get one property. Very, very, very difficult. And you are always thinking about, I have to pay the tax because tomorrow the landlord coming and said, you have to go. And you have to go. In Cuba, no one said to you, you have to go because it's your house. These reflections made me one Cuban young man in UK. He said, I don't have a properties. I'm always sleeping with the trousers in the middle of my legs, because maybe tomorrow my landlords need to leave me out of my house. And when we are young, we don't thinking about. But when we are arriving to one middle age, I have 15, I have a family, I have to think in this. This is one problem. But in Cuba, we do not have a big economy, we have many problems, but I have my own house for my family. This is important. This is important. And the young people not always thinking about this. This is one opportunity that we need to show with more, with this view. You are young today, but tomorrow you will need to think about your family, and you need to think about your future. Nobody will make a future in your country better than you, better than population, our population. That's my thought about that. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you again so much, Rafael. Thank you to all the other speakers. Thanks to the audience for showing up and asking such insightful questions. And thanks to the host for putting on this event. Before you leave, you are all going to stand up in a minute, don't worry. Before you leave, I know you know, Cubans are normally a little bit more exuberant and fun than British people. We're quite reserved at the end of the meeting. So we're going to show Rafael that Brighton can also end a meeting on a high. So if you can all stand up, please. And I'm just going to shout Cuba C. You're all going to shout blockade or no. Are you ready? Yeah. Cuba C. Cuba C. Cuba C. Venceremos. Toda vida.
Always to meet you. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, of course.
Thank you, everyone who's going to know.
Yes, absolutely.